Yeah. Okay. Hey, will you just remember, I don't get mad. I just get even. Yeah. Oh, hey. Yeah, just having some issues here. But you know, that sentiment of I don't get mad, I get even is expressed by a lot of people, even Christians sometimes. Well, today we're going to pick up kind of where we left off last week with Ephesians chapter 4, beginning in verse 25, where one of the things Paul says we need to put away is an unforgiving spirit. I just think how much better off we would be in our world if people would exercise that idea of forgiveness more and not worry about getting my pound of flesh. That's what we're going to look at. Hey, as we've always said, if you're not careful, you might just learn something before we're done. So let's get started. Well, as we're continuing in the series we started last week, some of you may, from years ago, have read of or heard of Corrie ten Boom. She was a Dutch watchmaker in a family of watchmakers in Holland. And when the Germans invaded in 1940 in the spring, of course, they went under occupation. Her father was a deep student of the Old Testament and really believed that the Jews were still God's chosen people. So they got involved in the underground and began hiding Jews and members of the Dutch resistance in their house. Between 1943 and 44, the ten Boom family illegally housed an unknown number of Jewish refugees and other members of the underground. They got ration cards. In fact, she went into the ration office. She knew the person who was responsible for handing out the ration cards, and she said that she in her mind was going to ask for 5 ration cards, and the number 100 popped out. And he gave her 100 ration cards that she could distribute and for people to be able to get food and other necessities. But as the old saying goes, no good deed goes unpunished. February the 28th, 1944, Jan Weigel had turned them in. He did it that morning. Within hours, the Gestapo was at the door, and about 30 people were arrested, including Corrie, her ailing father, her 2 sisters, and a brother were all arrested, and several others. The thing that really irritated the Gestapo, though, was they couldn't find any of the Jews that they were looking for. This is their shop. It's now the Ten Boom Museum in Haarlem, or as we would say in English, Haarlem, Holland. And upstairs is where they live. This is a picture of Corrie, and that was the entrance to the hiding place. And this is a cutout in the wall, so you can see the place where they would hide the refugees. And then in 1971, her memoirs were published. That also became a movie. And in her memoirs, she tells of this encounter that happened in 1947. It's 2 years after the war ended. And this was a chance meeting. It was in a church in Munich that I saw him. A balding, heavy-set man in a gray overcoat, a brown felt hat clutched between his hands. People were filing out of the basement room where I had just spoken. It was 1947, and I had come from Holland to defeated Germany with the message that God forgives. And keep in mind, Munich is ground zero for the Nazi movement. That's where Hitler got it started, where he staged a coup to try and overthrow the government of Bavaria and ended up going to prison. He wrote Mein Kampf, all that. So that's where she is just 2 years after the war ended. And that's when I saw him, working his way forward against the others. One moment, I saw the overcoat and brown hat. The next, a blue uniform and a visored cap with its skull and crossbones. It came back with a rush. The huge room with its harsh overhead lights, the pathetic pile of dresses and shoes in the center of the floor, and the shame of walking naked past this man. I could see my sister's frail form ahead of me, ribs sharp beneath the parchment of skin. Betsy, how thin you were. Corrie continued describing her experience. The former guard walked up to her and told her he had become a Christian after the war. He did not recognize her, but he reached his hand out and surprised her by asking her for forgiveness. And I stood there, I whose sins had every day to be forgiven and could not. Betsy had died in that place. Could he erase her slow, terrible death simply by asking? In the end, Corrie knew what she had to do. She had to forgive him, even though her emotions were fighting against it. And still I stood there with the coldness clutching my heart. But forgiveness is not an emotion. This is a key to remember. Forgiveness is not an emotion. I knew that too. Forgiveness is an act of the will, and the will can function regardless of the temperance of the heart. And after silently praying for what felt like an eternity, Corrie grabbed his hand, and with tears in her eyes, she forgave him and called him brother. And then she said, for a long moment we grasped each other's hands, the former guard and the former prisoner. I had never known God's love so intently as I did then. Her father didn't last very long once they were arrested. He only, I think, lived about a month before he died in a concentration camp. She and her sister ended up in Ravensbrück, which was a woman's only facility, and her sister wasn't in the best of health. Neither one of them ever married, and at the time the war started, they were both into their 50s. And on December 16th, 1944 is when her sister passed away in the camp. But Betsy, just before she died, told Corrie that there is no pit so deep that God is not deeper. And Corrie died on April 15th, 1983, which was her 91st birthday. And there's a Jewish tradition that says only special souls pass away on their birthday. Now I want to just think for a minute about what's the last time someone did you wrong. What was your response when someone hurt you? Now I've watched the movie The Hiding Place several times. I started to read the book when I was a teen. I can't remember if I finished it. I'm not sure if I did. But think about that. If you were in her position, being able to forgive someone who had come up and asked for it. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know that I could. But it's something that God expects of me. When you feel the urge to retaliate, when you've been wronged, or maybe you take no action right away, but you store it away for future reference and future use. Failure, though, to forgive can be devastating, more to you than anybody else. Someone told me this years ago: when you set out for revenge, dig 2 graves. One's for your intended, the other's for you. Because that's where you're going to put yourself, metaphorically speaking, not physically, really. But you're really putting yourself into a grave. And last week we started looking at some landmines that are in the path of the believer, looking at anger. And that is a natural lead into this one, dealing with forgiveness. And this lesson's actually a request that I got from someone who wanted a lesson on forgiveness. And another kind of partial disclaimer, partial confession, is this is not the preacher giving you one of those do as I say, not as I do sermons, because this is something I have struggled with. And most people, I think, if that have been honest enough and brave enough to share this with me, have struggled with it too. I can only think of maybe 2 people in my entire life that I know who could just let anything go and be able to forgive real easy. It's something that I believe we're all going to struggle with it. Even preachers are going to struggle with it. Elders and deacons are going to struggle with it. A couple of instances where I can think of where the actions of some others cost me jobs. And it's real hard to forgive when your livelihood is getting mixed up, getting messed with. But let's look at Ephesians chapter 4. We looked at this last week, but it goes along with what we are going to talk about today. Therefore, putting away lying, let each one of you speak truth with his neighbor, for we are members of one another. Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your wrath, nor give place to the devil. Let him who stole steal no longer, but rather let him labor, working with his hands what is good, that he may have something to give him who is in need. Let no corrupt word proceed out of your mouth, but what is good for necessary edification, that it may impart grace to the hearers. And do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, by whom you are sealed for the day of redemption. Let all bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. And be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God in Christ forgave you. I want us to look today at the idea of unforgiveness. Now, the request that I got actually had to deal with how to forgive and what that is. And so I'm taking it from a little bit different of a tack than what... a little bit different track than what I was asked about. But I want us to start by, we're going to look at unforgiveness. And I want you to look at what Paul says here, to let all bitterness and wrath and anger and evil speaking be put away from you. That sounds easy, doesn't it? But it's not always easy to take the words and put them into action. How many of us have tried to maybe put something together, or maybe you're going to hang, let's say, lights, security lights or something around your house. Do it yourself. It's easy. So you get started on it, and then you connect two wires that you shouldn't have, and then you've blacked out half the neighborhood. Yeah, it's easy if you know what you're doing. And what Paul says here always looks easy, and I have been on the receiving end of lectures about how it's easy to forgive and I need to do it. And yes, I've been on the lecturing end where I'm lecturing someone. Now, you know you need to forgive. And it's easy to say it, but the emotional work sometimes is where we get tripped up, isn't it? The definition of unforgiveness. Let's look there for just a second. And to understand that, we need to look and see what's the definition of forgiveness. And here's the definition I came up with, or it's not original with me. But forgiveness is the willingness to give up your resentment towards someone who has wronged you. And that's regardless of how serious it is. And I think back over the years where people have been wronged, and there are people who have been legitimately wronged. Someone has actually done something to them that was clearly wrong, unethical, maybe even illegal. And when they are on the receiving end of it, the idea of being able to let it go sometimes is not going to be easy. On the other hand, I've seen some people that have had some pretty petty things happen, but they make a big deal about it. And they hang on to it and they cling to it for a long period of time. But the idea of forgiveness is, I'm not going to hold on to this to bring it up at you at a later point. Forgiveness means that you renounce any desire to get even. And if you think about it, if you have wronged me and I'm just thinking about getting even, who am I really hurting by dwelling on getting even? I'm not really hurting you, am I? I'm hurting me. And I'm holding all of that within me because I'm just thinking, I've got to even the score. And then what happens? So you did something here, so I'm going to come back. Not only am I going to even it, but I'm going to one-up you. So then what are you going to do? Well, you're going to come back and you're going to try and it just keeps escalating. That in a lot of ways is how wars get started between countries. It is because some country, some diplomat, somebody offended the diplomat in another country, and they just keep going back and forth until finally the shooting starts. Now there are some elements to forgiveness, to give up resentment about the wrong. Not only that, but resentment about the wrongdoer. And then you give up the idea of retaliation. Now, unforgiveness, on the other hand, is going to be the opposite of this. I am going to hang on to my desire to get even. I'm going to claim my desire to get even as a right. Well, you did this to me, so I've got a right to come back on you. But as we'll see here in just a bit, that's not something, as a Christian, I should be doing. But unforgiveness is going to be the deliberate mindset that I've got to get even. I've got to even the score. In Ephesians chapter 4, Paul associates unforgiveness with malice and slander and bitterness and a bunch of other things that a Christian shouldn't have. Now, Christians are going to, we are human. We're going to have hurt feelings. And we looked at last week that there's nothing wrong with being angry. There's nothing wrong with feeling the hurt. But it's when we cross a line where I'm not going to forget it. I'm not going to forgive you for this. That's where we've got a problem. So looking at a description of unforgiveness, because the unforgiving heart is going to cling to past wrongs and refuse to extend what has already been extended. In other words, I'm not going to extend to you the forgiveness that God has extended to me. God's forgiven me of my sins, and if you If you think about it, it's real easy for me to accept, okay, God's forgiven me. God forgive me for doing it. Okay, God's forgiven me. And then you come and say, hey, forgive me for doing X, Y, or Z. And I say, yeah, really? After what you did or what you said, you expect me? Well, yeah, that's what God expects. And we're going to look at the biblical example of that here in just a minute. We have to remember that bitterness takes root in our hearts. That's when godly traits will start to be choked out. How many of us know somebody that we have known maybe for years and we can't think of a time when they were not an angry, bitter person? I don't know too many of them, but there are a few that I have known. And I've seen it down here working at the school. There are some kids that are already at that stage. It's unfortunate, but given the circumstances many of them have in their homes, they're already becoming angry and bitter, and that's not good. That's not good for their health, because really when we choose to not forgive, we are making a deliberate decision and we are inflicting pain on ourselves. Forgiveness is going to be a choice. Now, modern science, and I use the term very loosely, is looking at things, ways to not take responsibility. It is not my fault that I turned into that I've turned into a criminal, that I have gone out and am involved in crime, involved in drugs. All that is because of the way I was brought up. It's not my fault. It's my parents' fault because they didn't raise me right. It's the fault of the schools. But when you look at what the scriptures say, who is responsible for my behavior? I am. We can keep going through looking for the trait for this or for that behavior or this behavior or that decision, but ultimately it comes down to my decision. So if I am wronged by somebody, it is my choice whether or not I forgive them. If I decide to hang on to that resentment, then who am I really hurting? Well, I'm hurting myself. It is self-inflicted pain, just like if I take a knife and slit my wrist. That is self-inflicted. This is a form of self-inflicted pain if I am just going to hang on to that bitterness and to that resentment. There's a point where it's got to be let go, because as a believer, I need to be constantly forgiving of you, and you need to be constantly forgiving of everybody else. We need to be forgiving of each other as Christ has forgiven, as God through Christ has forgiven us. It is through Christ that, remember, He has bridged that gap between God and between man so that we are forgiven once and for all. But we also have to extend it to others. Believers also have to remember that God gave up His only Son. Remember how much it cost God. And if God can do that, give up His Son, and look at the abuse Jesus went through, and He can still forgive, can't I forgive? If somebody like Corrie ten Boom can go through a concentration camp and come out of that and still have a forgiving heart. And notice it wasn't easy for her when that guard came up and asked forgiveness. But she did it. She made the choice. What have we gone through that would be anything like that, where we can't make that choice? And then consider too that unforgiveness is disobedience to God. It's really going to hurt my pride because you've said something or you've done something that offended me. Generally speaking, a lot of those times had nothing to do with me getting physically hurt. It was an emotional hurt that was inflicted on me by somebody else. And it is pride and rebellion that says, no, I'm not going to forgive. I'm going to continue to hold it against you. But remember what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. He gave us a warning there that God does want to answer prayer, but if we refuse to forgive, God will also not forgive. Forgive us of our trespasses as we do what? Forgive those who have trespassed against us. And keep in mind that if I'm not going to forgive you for whatever you've done, I'm not showing the proper appreciation to God for forgiving me. And there's an old expression about there but for the grace of God go I. I could easily be someone who is on the receiving end of God's wrath. But God, because I was baptized into Christ for the forgiveness of my sins, I have God's forgiveness. And we have to remember that we are all on that common ground. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Let's not forget that. Okay, maybe I haven't murdered or committed armed robbery or some felony act, but I've still sinned before God. I have still received that forgiveness from God, which to turn that around means I need to remember to extend that towards others, because we are never given the right to keep an unforgiving spirit or to harbor an unforgiving spirit. I have come across some Christians who did that. They would never forgive someone for doing X, Y, or Z to them. But God says to forgive. Matthew 18, if you want to turn over there, we're going to look at that here in just a minute. But right now, let's look at what Jesus said about the 70 times 7. No, it is not that I keep track. 70 times 7, I think 490. Okay, 488, 89, 90, 491. Nope, sorry, not going to forgive you anymore. Have that forgiving spirit, that forgiving attitude. And sometimes we might have to, here we go again. Oh, here he comes. He's done this before. What am I going to do? But then stop and think about how God, when we come to God, and God, I want to ask forgiveness for, and then fill in the blank with some recurring sin that you are constantly having to ask forgiveness for. And just think how God must feel when we keep coming to Him for the same thing. But He still forgives. When we look at the destruction that unforgiveness brings. Last week I used the illustration of a house. My mother once had to wait I think it was about 6 months for a house to be built. Standard 3-bedroom, 2-bath, 1,500 square feet, whatever it was. 6 months to build and get it ready for occupancy. How long would it take to destroy that house? I could drive my car through it right now and boom, within seconds, it's destroyed. I could walk off and leave a pot of soup or something cooking on the stove and it starts a fire, and the house may not be destroyed, but it's going to be pretty heavily damaged after all those months it took to build. How long does it take an angry or an unforgiving attitude to destroy or damage a relationship? A matter of seconds maybe, or minutes. That's the destruction unforgiveness can bring. Look at Matthew chapter 18. And look at the parable Jesus told there. In Matthew chapter 18, verse 21, where he says, Peter came to him and said, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Up to 7 times? And because they were told that you only had to forgive 3 times, so Peter thinks he's really going the extra mile by going more than double. And Jesus said to him, I do not say to you up to 7 times, but up to 70 times 7. Therefore the kingdom of heaven is like a certain king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. And when he had begun to settle accounts, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. But as he was not able to pay, his master commanded that he be sold with his wife and children, and all that he had, and that payment be made. But the servant therefore fell down before him, saying, Master, have patience with me, and I will pay you all. Then the master of the servant was moved with compassion, released him, and forgave him the debt. So right there, he's pleading for mercy, you notice. And the master forgives him. So there's grace, mercy and grace, both right there. But that servant went out and found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii, and he laid hands on him and took him by the throat, saying, Pay me what you owe me. So his fellow servant fell down at his feet and begged him, saying, Have patience with me, and I will pay you all. And he would not, but went and threw him into prison till he should pay the debt. So when his fellow servants saw what had been done, they were very grieved, and came and told their master all that had been done. Then his master, after he had called him, said to him, You wicked servant, I forgave you all the debt because you begged me. Should you not have had compassion on your fellow servant just as I had pity on you? And his master was angry and delivered him to the torturers until he should pay all that was due him. So my heavenly Father also will do to you if each of you from his heart does not forgive his brother of his trespasses. So you can see what Jesus is telling us here. First of all, God, to forgive others is a requirement to have our prayers answered. We also see that if we don't forgive, it's going to make us bitter in our prayer life, and our worship is going to be affected. Later on, Jesus tells us to, if you bring your gift to the altar, and realize that your brother's got something against you, leave your gift at the altar and go make things right with your brother. Now stop and think for a minute. When you come in and there's something on your mind and you're trying to worship God, and what a distraction it can be. Maybe I had an argument with my wife this morning, or maybe I had an argument with my neighbor last night, or I've got some other issue going on. And rather than concentrating on the singing, or on the prayers, or on the lesson, I'm just sitting there in the pews just smoking. And people are, hey, what's that burning smell? Because the smoke's coming out of my ears. And I'm just sitting there fuming over whatever the situation is because I was offended. Isn't my worship to God going to be vain under that circumstance? Am I really even worshiping God? I'm just sitting here, not really. Oh, here's communion. Which, by the way, when he talks about taking it in an unworthy manner, it's got a lot to do with our attitude and what we're concentrating and thinking on. So I take the communion. And here's somebody up here now who's leading us in prayer. And instead of thinking about the prayer or praying along, I'm still thinking about that offense that was committed against me. And then the Bible class or the sermon is presented, and then I get up, good sermon, preacher, and just go on out. Did I really worship God under that certain? No, I didn't. My mind and everything was preoccupied with whatever was caused the offense for me to now have bitter feelings and grudges towards my neighbors. Now remember, the servant here was forgiven of a debt that he could not pay. There's no way he was going to pay that. How many of us could pay our debt to God? Now you could take Bill Gates and Donald Trump and Ross Perot and who's the guy out at Amazon? I forget his name. But you could add all them up, and don't forget Apple computers and all them, and they could write the check for their entire net worth. And it's not going to be enough to pay God to cover the debt for even one sin. And we've all sinned, remember. I remember when Donald Trump was asked if he had sinned or needed to ask forgiveness for anything, and he said, no, I'm watching on TV. Excuse me, Mr. Trump? There is something there you might want to think about, and that is pride. Remember, when we fail to act according to the forgiveness that we received, or this servant did, his forgiveness was retracted. You're going to go be handed over now to the jailer until you've paid everything, because he would not extend forgiveness to his fellow servant. We've got an obligation to live in accordance with that kind of forgiveness, that we forgive and have a duty to forgive, and an appreciation to God that we forgive our fellow servants down here. If we want to put others into prison until they've paid every penny, then it shows that we're not really appreciative to God of the forgiveness that we have. That we're kind of setting ourselves up on a pedestal. I'm good enough to take God's forgiveness, but I am too good for you to forgive you. And then when it comes to dealing with unforgiveness, I have to confront and assume full responsibility. In other words, sure, you may have said something or did something that was an over-the-top, outrageous offense, but how I reacted to it is my choice. Whether I decide to hang on to the anger and the bitterness, that's up to me. And I have to assume responsibility. Yes, I am angry with you. Yes, I am bitter towards you because, whatever it was that happened. I've got to assume responsibility for my own decisions and my own actions, just like everybody else does. I can't blame it on, I would, but I didn't get enough toys when I was a kid, so that's why I'm behaving the way I am. Or I got too many toys, or whatever it is. Mom didn't show me enough affection, or Dad didn't show me enough. It's on me. I have to assume that responsibility. I have to acknowledge the unforgiveness that I have in my heart, confess it to God. That God, I am having a problem forgiving this person. And then I have to also lay that aside. It comes down to a decision. Most of us all of us make decisions every day. I get up, decide what to wear. Decide what I'm going to eat. Well, I have to decide to lay aside the anger and the unforgiving spirit that I have. And I'm going to acknowledge it's not always going to be easy to implement it and actually be able to carry it out. The emotions are going to be there. But that's where we have to use some reasoning and really put forth the effort and acknowledge that it's there and put forth to get rid of it. And then the process for forgiveness is to recognize your issue. Recognize, this is me. I have to do the forgiving. Now, sometimes it might be something where you do have to step back. I years ago had an issue with a member of a congregation where I was, and I went and worshiped elsewhere because it was distracting to me, and it was the whole situation was distracting to some others. And so I made that decision just to withdraw for a while. And you might have to do something like that too. And then remember, you have to give up your own sinful rights. I have to give up my right to want retribution. I have to give up any right that I might have to want my pound of flesh. I've got to give that up to God. Let God deal with it. Maybe there was something unethical or even illegal that happened. God's going to deal with that in His own time. And then I have to begin by praying for a change of heart. Change of heart in me. That I can show the forgiving spirit that God showed me. And I can extend the forgiving spirit to whoever it is that offended it to me. So then, when it comes to forgiveness, demonstrating it and showing it. And this is where it can get really tricky, because I have to forgive others the way that God forgave me. And this is where I really don't want to. I want to hang on to my anger. Why anybody wants to do that, I don't know, but some do. And not only do we need to forgive others, but we need to actually give up that bitterness and not let it dwell within us. Because really, if you can't forgive the same way God forgives you, then you are keeping yourself in bondage. It goes back to that self-inflicted wound. I'm choosing to hurt myself. I'm not hurting you any. I heard someone years ago, I think it came out of a movie, say that half the people that you hate don't care, the other half the people you hate don't know it. And when it comes to forgiveness, it's kind of the same thing. If I'm harboring a grudge against you, you probably won't know it. And you might not even care if I was to tell you. So who am I really hurting by having all that hate and bitterness and unforgiveness? I'm hurting me. In the end, it's not doing anything to you. So how can you know you've forgiven someone? One of the ways to know for sure is that your feelings toward them have changed. I've gone from, here he comes. Let me see. Bathroom's down. I'm going to suddenly have to go to the bathroom. Oh, here he comes. Where's the back door to this place so I can get out of here? I'm avoiding him, not having anything to do with him. Oh, yeah, he's the one that caused me that problem in the meeting last week. Okay, but now where my feelings have changed, I see him coming in. Doesn't bother me. There's a sign there that I have forgiven that other person. And then when you have a genuine concern for that person. I have known people who refuse to pray. I don't want to pray for that person. Why? Well, because I hate him. What do you mean? Wait a minute. Aren't you? Yeah, but he did so-and-so. He said, and that's not the attitude as a Christian that I should have. Think about, too, last week we talked about anger and the collateral damage it can have when we have uncontrolled anger. How do you think the collateral damage is when we have uncontrolled or unforgiveness in our hearts? And by that I mean the scenario, at a restaurant, your steak didn't come out the way it wanted. Instead of saying, hey, would you mind taking this back and fixing it and making it right, you just blow up at the waitress or the waiter. And here's your spouse or your friends are sitting there and they're thinking, oh, come on, can you not do that? And then your kids are sitting there, oh, wow, daddy or mommy or whoever is blowing up like that. And then your other people, I thought he's a Christian. Seriously? You see, that's the collateral damage. And unforgiveness can be the same way. I'm not going to forgive you. I'm hurting myself. But then when it becomes apparent I've got this unforgiving attitude, wait a minute. I thought Jesus said to forgive, and you're not. Wait a minute. How's that? Huh? You're going to do a lot of other harm in that regard to the cause of Christ. So unforgiveness can explode slowly. It can destroy, just like anger can. God blesses those when we choose to forgive, when we show that forgiving spirit that Christ did on the cross. Always going to be easy? No. For some of the stuff that goes on, it's going to be hard, very hard. But God still wants us to do it, and that's why He gives us the avenue of prayer, gives us each other as a support. So this morning, if you need a change in attitude, we'd be glad to pray for you. If you need prayers for anything else, we'd be glad to pray for you for that. So this morning, think about where you are, and if you need the prayers of the congregation, we'll stand in a minute, we'll sing, or we can talk privately, pray together privately, whatever. It's up to you. If we can help you in any way, let us know as together we stand and as we sing.